Well, welcome to week 7. So this week we're going to finish up looking at writing, although that's something that we're going to bring up in other weeks as well as we look at ancient Mesopotamia. But we'll finish up looking at the basics of the beginnings of writing, and then we're going to move into the next period of history. Well, now we're actually entering history because we have written documents that really can be read, called the early dynastic period, and this is the height of Sumerian civilization. So we'll be talking about that this week and also next week. So last time we looked at the origins of writing in Mesopotamia. We saw how it originally came about for economic purposes, for accounting, administrative purposes. But I wanted to mention other writing systems in the Near East in general, just to kind of give you a little bit of perspective, such as the Egyptian system of hieroglyphs. Egyptian writing was developed on its own. It was not an outgrowth of Mesopotamian writing. It was a completely different writing system for a completely different language. It looks like it was invented rather quickly rather than a slow development as in Mesopotamia. It was made up of monoconsonant and biconsonant symbols, so it was syllabic, like later Mesopotamian writing. Each of these symbols represents a complex unit of sound, although they did have symbols for one consonant. But it was all used together. So, for example, this is a symbol of the sun, and it makes the sound re or ra for the sun god. This is the symbol for men. This is a scarab beetle known as a keper in ancient Egyptian, which was a symbol of everlasting life. And it spells out Menkhepere, which was one of the names of Tutankhamun. So just like in Mesopotamia, only a few people could really read and write. Egyptian scribes had to be trained for years. They were specialized practitioners. Now, out of Egyptian writing, out of this system that included, multi-consonant symbols as well as monoconsonant symbols, the alphabet was invented. Right? Now, one of the interesting things about the alphabet, as you're going to see, you may have wondered, many people don't, but sometimes people wonder, why does an M look like that? Why does an A look like that? Is there actually a reason? Why does an E look like this? And I always assumed, incorrectly, that it was just kind of random. That whoever invented the alphabet made up signs to symbolize different sounds, but there was no rhyme or reason to it. Totally wrong. There actually is a rhyme and a reason. There is a reason why, for example, an M looks like the way it does, an A, a B, etc. The alphabet looks like it was invented by the Canaanites, people who lived in the eastern Levant, the area where the Natufians lived. So the later culture of the Canaanites, it looks like they basically took the idea of mono-consonant symbols from the ancient Egyptian writing system and then kind of took that out of their writing system and created a new system, the alphabet. And of course, the alphabet was a breakthrough in human literacy, because rather than learning several hundred or 1,000 different symbols, you could learn 22 to 30 symbols and actually be able to read and write. Students who take Greek at Grand Valley or other languages where they have to learn a new alphabet, say in general that they can learn an alphabet in a week or two and be able to read Greek, in a week or two. They may not understand what it says because it's a different language, but they can read it. Okay, so why do things look the way they do? Well, the ancient Canaanites, again, they took the idea from the Egyptians, but then they created something new. They wanted a symbol to signify the ah sound. So they took a word from their language, an ancient Semitic language, the alf, which means an ox. And what they would do is draw the ox. Now, over time, the later Canaanites, who are known as the Phoenicians, made that symbol more abstract, and then over time it became our letter A. Right? So our letter A is essentially an upside down ox head. Okay, what about the B sound? Well, the word for house in ancient Canaanite is beit, and so they drew a house, and over time that house became our letter B. This one I particularly like, man calling, hey, like that. Turn it over on its side, it becomes our letter E. And so you can see this with many of the letters that we're so used to. For example, letter K, I like this one as well. Kopf, right, which is palm in the ancient Canaanite language. So they drew a hand, you can see here, with fingers. And over time it became more abstract. It became our letter K. Mem is water, right? So they drew waves on the water, and those waves became our letter M. So every time you're reading the alphabet, every time you're reading on your computer, on your phone, what have you, you're using a system that goes back to 1500 BC and was invented by the Canaanites. This system was then adopted for the Greek writing system, the Roman writing system, later on the Cyrillic alphabet for Russian, the alphabets used for many European languages, the alphabets for Arabic, Hebrew, Aramaic, right, and so forth. So many alphabetic systems that are used today originally come out of this early Canaanite Phoenician alphabet. You can see the later Phoenician alphabet, this is even more like our alphabets, right? Here's another one I like, Resh, head, right? So you can see it's just missing that piece, and it would be turned the other direction, and it would look like our letter R. Right? Okay, so those are some of the writing systems in the ancient Near East, and there are others. We're going to talk a little later about, for example, the Hittites. The Hittites developed their own hieroglyphic script, and they live in what is now Turkey, basically the area near ancient Çatalhöyük. So they created their own writing system as well. All right, now let's take a look at the next period after the Uruk period. Okay, so last time we finished up looking at the Uruk period. We'll mention the end of the Uruk period again today. The next period is a short period known as the Jemdet Nasr period. We'll talk about it. It's a period that is sort of a transition between the Uruk period and the large period that comes next, known as the early Dynastic. And some of the differences between the early Dynastic and the Uruk period, we see those changes start to appear in this transitional period. Jemdet Nasr is named again after the site where it was first identified, a site called Jemdet Nasr. The early Dynastic period is named the early Dynastic because this is when we have full-fledged writing, and this is when we start to have dynasties, lists of kings that can be, whose names can be read, right? So this is why it's called the early Dynastic. And the early Dynastic is separated into different periods. And we're going to look at a few of them. We're going to look up to about early Dynastic 3. And you're not going to have to memorize, what appeared in the period 1 or 2. Right? We're going to talk about the period as a whole. But next week, we're going to focus on some of the finds from the later period of the early Dynastic. Okay, so last time we looked at the end of the Uruk expansion. We saw that a lot of those sites, like Abuba Kabira, Arslan Tepe. They were abandoned. Northern Mesopotamia declines slightly at the end of the Uruk period. Southern Mesopotamia keeps on going. And then during the early dynastic, things pick up again in northern Mesopotamia. And, they again start to rival some of the things going on in the south. Okay, so what we see during the Jemdet Nasr period is an increase in the role of kings and also the beginnings of cuneiform. So this is the period where they took those pictograms and they started to use that reed stylus to draw on the clay tablets using cuneiform. We're going to start to see how important the palace becomes in Mesopotamian civilization. You can see this piece of artwork over here. This shows a typical kind of scene that's repeated in a lot of Mesopotamian art, and it's of a hero figure wrestling or grappling with wild animals. Sometimes they're called combat scenes, right, or hero scenes, but this is a kind of motif that you see repeated on cylinder seals and other works of art in Mesopotamia. And you can see some of the typical pottery from the time. Okay, well, what we had in the Uruk period were those clear religious buildings that were temples and also workshops and storage places and maybe administrative areas. But we had nothing that was what we would call a palace. Now, during the Jemdet Nasr period is where we start to have buildings that we can identify as palaces. And of course, with palaces are kings. So this seems to be evidence that kings are separating themselves from the temple. They are becoming more and more powerful and in many respects becoming kind of a rival to temple power, as we're going to see. And so you might ask yourself, like in this previous slide, how could we tell what a palace actually looked like? Well, we know what a temple looked like. Temple is usually tripartite building with an area for the image of the god and a offering table. We saw some of the buildings in the Uruk and the Aeana precinct that looked like they were built for crafts or maybe built for other ritual purposes, right? But palaces do not have a tripartite room structure. They actually are built around central open courtyards. Inside of these buildings, archaeologists have found a lot of seals, ceilings, and also cuneiform tablets, which point to some sort of administration going on. Okay, so you will have, usually in a palace, a long room, which is typically, we know from later periods, a throne room. This is where the king would greet dignitaries, other officials, people like that. But then, and we're going to see this with later palaces in Mesopotamia, these different rooms are used for different things, including domestic spaces, right? So this is, and as we'll emphasize again, in Mesopotamia, a palace is called, the name for it in Sumerian is Egal, big house, right? So it's just a big, important house of the king. So there follows this sort of house plan, but this is where the king and his family live. This is where scribes would work, craft specialists, etc. So it would be a little bit like in Washington, D.C., comparing the White House, which is, executive functions, versus, let's say, a cathedral. This is a map of one of the cathedrals in Washington, D.C., and if you looked at it architecturally, you could see, there's clearly a difference. And if we sort of take that idea of form following function, here we can see different rooms used for different functions and separated clearly from each other and distinct, rather than a very, very large public space where a lot of people would gather. So the very, very clear differences. And so when you look at the palaces, they don't look anything like temples. There's no area area for where the god would be. There's lots of different rooms that are used for specific functions. So in the palace that was found in the Jemdet Nasr period, they found 250 clay tablets written in that cuneiform that we saw before. They're talking about plots of land, distribution of barley to workers, administration of animals, management of labor, things like that. Showing that the palace is becoming an executive power. It has its own administration. Right? So here you can see one of those early cuneiform tablets. This is a jar of beer. This is barley. This is a symbol for the temple. You can see the symbol for plow. And as we said before, this means to distribute rations. Okay, so during the Jemdet Nasr period, all of these kind of large towns or small cities from the Uruk period that really couldn't compete with Uruk now start to get bigger and bigger. And we start to see many, many cities appearing, first in the Jemdet Nasr, and then it increases in the early Dynastic. This becomes a time period of many different cities. And so one of the things that we see in the Jemdet Nasr period is on clay tablets, we find seals, but also writing that list cities. And many of these cities from later documents, we can actually read these early pictographs. We know what cities they represent. There's kind of a list that goes in the same order on the seal that's impressed on these clay tablets, but also on the writing that lists the cities, right? So here's a fragment of one of these city lists. They have found these city lists in different cities, showing that it's not just one city that has this document. It's many of the cities that are mentioned on the document that have this list. And here you can see this fragment from one city has the same order of cities that you can see here on this list from another city, and it matches up with the seals. So what does this mean? The fact that there's a list of cities in the same order, what could this possibly mean? What would you think? If each city has kind of a list of all the cities in the same order on these official documents, what's going on here? Well, some people think it might be a political or an economic alliance. Or maybe it's kind of like a league of cities, like you had in ancient Greece. You had the Delian League. You also had leagues like this in medieval Europe. So we don't know exactly what it is. Is it a political alliance? Is it an economic alliance? Some sort of treaty? We're not exactly sure. But it looks like what it shows is some sort of cooperation at the beginning between these cities. Right? Here's some more of that Jemdet Nasr pottery. Okay, so the centralized leadership of the cities starts to increase in power. There is increasing interaction among these city-states, right? And this continues and intensifies in the early dynastic period. So more and more cities, fewer rural sites. Uruk already has reached its maximum size and begins to actually start to decrease a little bit as some of these other cities become more powerful. And these cities are independent of each other. They're separate political entities in the early dynastic period. So you can see here during kind of the end of the Uruk into the early dynastic, these small sites around, for example, the city of Nippur are abandoned as the city gets larger. Same with Uruk, right? So there's some of the processes we saw with Uruk in the Uruk period we see with other cities during this period. Centralization of the population. People are abandoning the sites and moving to larger and larger sites. And we're going to talk about why that might be the case. And by the early dynastic, as we're going to see, by the end of the early dynastic period, 78%, they think, of the population is living in cities. Right? So obviously they're still farming. Farming is the basis of the civilization. But they're urban farmers. They leave the cities, go to their fields, and come back to the cities at night. And so that's kind of amazing, because usually we think of, in ancient civilizations, we think as, some people living in cities, but mostly rural population. But not the case in Mesopotamia. Most of the population, at least according to the data that we have, seems to have been living in cities. So here you can see the different cities at this time. Okay, so the Gemet Nasr period is a period that's still being looked at. Because they're still writing in that archaic form of cuneiform, we can't read many of the documents. I mean, we know many of them are administrative and dealing with bureaucracy and things like that. But in the early dynastic period is when we start to get full-fledged writing, right? So we get written evidence, and we also get archaeological evidence. So we're really entering the period of history. We can mark this as history because we have documents describing events, and we can use that and the archaeology together. So we have texts on politics, on myths, on the economy, and then we can use that with the archaeology as well. Right? And again, it's the early dynastic because this is when we start to have dynasties, essentially. Okay, so writing becomes more important, and it's not just used for administration, it's used for other things as well. So the uses expand, as we talked about before. And in the next few weeks, we're going to look at some of these documents, and you are actually reading one of them in translation, the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is the oldest epic poem written down, much older than the Odyssey or the Iliad. The version you're reading goes back to about 600, 700 BC, but the poem itself is much earlier than that. Probably portions of the poem go back to somewhere in 2000 BC. Okay, so what sort of documents give us some insight into the early dynastic period? Well, there's a particular later document that describes things going on during the early dynastic. It's called the Sumerian King List. And it describes more than 1,000 years, we think, of kingship. It's not accurate, as you'll see, but it does give a list of kings. On some of these king lists, Gilgamesh is listed as king of Uruk. So many people believe there actually was a real king called Gilgamesh, and then the epic was sort of a mythological stories that were focused on that particular king, right? There are different copies of the list in different cities. It was written down over and over for generations, right? That is, they kept on making new copies to keep it in the records. It lists Mesopotamian rulers from very early times, from, it says, before the flood, to the 18th century BC. So it was written after the early dynastic, but it talks about this period. So it gives us a little bit of an idea of some of the things going on, at least the way Mesopotamians envision kingship. But as you'll see, the dates are not accurate at all. It talks about kingship descending to Eridu and then passing to different cities. And this is inaccurate because it makes it seem like each of those cities in turn ruled over all of southern Mesopotamia. As we're going to see, this is not the case. Each of these cities are independent. They're like city-states. Okay, so you can see some of the list here. It talks about this king ruled for this number of years. You'll see the numbers here are totally inflated, not even by a little, by a lot. Like this person ruled 21,000 years, that kind of thing. So what was the point of this document? Well, it might have been used for propaganda within the city for political purposes, right? One, in later times, it implied that rulers in the past had ruled over the whole region, right? It also legitimized the particular rule of the king of that city that was being written down, right? So that is, they would change the list so that it would end with a certain king or a certain city, so make it look like that city is in line with all of these other kings. So, for example, from the king's list, it says, after the kingship descended from heaven, a kingship was in Eridu. Alulim became king. He ruled for 28,800 years. Alaljar ruled for 36,000 years. Two kings, they ruled for 64,800 years. Then Eridu fell, and the kingship was taken to Badabira. In Badabira, Enmenluana ruled for 43,200 years, etc., etc. Okay, why else is this interesting? Some scholars find this interesting because it parallels pretty closely in terms of format portions of the Bible, when talking about the lineage leading from Adam and Eve and the children of Adam and Eve all the way up to Abraham. So it's basically giving the whole lineage with Noah there in the middle. So, in Genesis 5, it goes up to Noah's sons, right? But you can see when Enoch lived 65 years, he became the father of Methuselah. After he became the father of Methuselah, Enoch walked faithfully with God 300 years, and had other sons and daughters. Enoch lived a total of 365 years. When Methuselah had lived 187 years, he became the father of Lamech. After he became the father of Lamech, he lived 782 years. Right? So you might have heard that expression, as old as Methuselah. That's what they're talking about. So that's the first part, and then later on in Genesis it goes, I'm not going to read this whole thing. You can read it on your own if you want. Genesis 11 talks about Shem, who's one of the sons of Noah, right? And it goes through all of them. This is the portions that maybe they don't make you read too closely in Sunday school. It's so-and-so, this number of years, so-and-so, blah, 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 blah. And then it finally gets to Terah, who is the father of Abram, before his name is changed to Abraham. Right? So the list is like the format of the Sumerian Kings list, which is not a surprise because what Mesopotamian archaeology has shown is that a lot of the Bible fits within the cultural framework of the ancient Middle East, the ancient Near East. There's whole classes that are taught on this. How does, for example, how does the Ten Commandments fit into the typical covenant treaties between kings and their patron gods and things like that. So the Bible is written in a similar way to other ancient Middle Eastern documents, which should again not be too surprising. But the Sumerian Kings list also mentions a flood, that there are kings before the flood and after the flood. Now, because Mesopotamia is extremely flat, and these rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, do flood their banks typically between February and May, it's not surprising that a catastrophic flood would be a powerful image and something that would have made it into the stories and the mythology of the ancient Mesopotamians. Right? And you're going to read in the Epic of Gilgamesh, Gilgamesh's encounter with the survivor of the ancient flood, a man named Utnapishtim. That's from the Epic of Gilgamesh, but there are other flood stories that are earlier than the Epic of Gilgamesh. They go back to Sumeria. Okay, so in southern Mesopotamia, we start getting these very large city-states. Umma, Lagash. For example, Lagash becomes something like 400 hectares. Uruk, Ur, Shurpa, Kish, Nippur, others. We're going to look at some of these other cities. In northern Mesopotamia, they decline for a little bit, and then they start to reemerge. So we're going to see some of the city-states that emerge in, for example, Syria and other places during this time. So urbanism spreads widely in the early dynastic, but it's not the same thing as what is going on in Greece with, for example, Athens and Sparta and Ionia, right? Because it's not one city, one state. Sometimes multiple cities are being ruled over by a more powerful city. And we're going to see examples of this, right? So, just because you see a city on the map doesn't mean it's independent. It actually can be run by one of its neighbors, which is more powerful. Right? So it's not quite the same, but it's similar in the fact that, one, each city has its own king. Each city has its own major temple and patron god. So each city had its own god, even though all of the Mesopotamians, all of the Sumerians believed in all of the gods and knew the gods were important in different aspects. They believed that certain gods were looking down over and protecting specific cities. All right, we're going to be talking about more about Mesopotamian religion today. Okay, we also start to see walls being built around these cities. Right, so Uruk, becomes 480 hectares and starts to decrease in the early dynastic period. City of Lagash becomes 400 hectares. Gilgamesh, it says in the Epic of Gilgamesh, builds the walls, the fortification walls around the city of Uruk. So this is, again, kind of an urban implosion. People moving into these different cities. For many of them, there's abandonment of villages about 5 kilometers around the city. Where the question is, were people forcibly settled in there, or were they going on their own, like we've talked about earlier? And that's an important thing to look at. Why did people move to these cities? Not just Uruk and the Uruk period, but all these other cities during this early dynastic period.